What would you do if you gave everything you had to help a young boy, only for him to vanish without a trace? In this heart-wrenching yet inspiring story, Mrs. Florida, a childless woman, makes the ultimate sacrifice to support Morgan, an orphaned boy with a bright future. She sells her home, leaving herself homeless, all in the hope of giving him a better life. But when Morgan disappears without a word, Mrs. Florida is left shattered, questioning if her kindness was in vain. Years later, in a shocking twist, Morgan returns, but not as the boy she once knew. Watch the full video to discover. If this is your first time on our channel, take a moment to subscribe to our channel as we dive into the full story. To our returning subscribers, thank you for always watching and liking our videos. Now let's get into the full story. Mrs. Florida sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the walls of her modest home. The quiet of the house had become her constant companion, and though she had grown used to it over the years, there was still an emptiness that gnawed at her soul. At 40, she had long given up the dream of having children of her own. Life had dealt her a cruel hand, and she had learned to accept it, even if it left her feeling hollow. She filled her days with work, small acts of charity, and the occasional visit from friends. But her heart longed for something more. She often found herself walking through the city, observing the children playing in the streets or heading to school. Their laughter, their energy, it was something she cherished from a distance but could never truly partake in. One afternoon, as she made her way to the local market, she spotted a young boy sitting alone on a bench. His clothes were worn, his shoes barely holding together. He had a book in his hand, though it looked like it had been read too many times to count. There was something about him, his quiet demeanor, the way he focused on the book, that caught her attention. "Are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Florida asked, taking a seat beside him. The boy looked up, startled by her presence. His dark eyes were filled with a mixture of surprise and sadness. He nodded but said nothing. Mrs. Florida smiled warmly. "What are you reading?" The boy hesitated before showing her the book. It was an old textbook, the pages yellowed and frayed. "It's for school," he finally mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you go to school around here?" she asked, trying to make conversation. He shook his head. "Oh, I don't go to school anymore. I used to, but things changed." Mrs. Florida's heart ached at his words. She had seen too many children in situations like his, bright, full of potential, but held back by circumstances beyond their control. She had always wished she could do more to help. "What's your name, dear?" "Morgan," the boy replied, glancing back down at his book. "Nice to meet you, Morgan. I'm Mrs. Florida." She paused, watching him closely. "Do you live around here?" Morgan shook his head again. "I don't have anywhere to live." Her heart broke a little more. She could tell there was more to his story, but she didn't want to press him. Instead, she simply sat with him in silence, offering a comforting presence. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked after a few moments. Morgan looked up, surprised by the offer. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, please." Mrs. Florida smiled, standing up and extending her hand to him. "Come on, let's get you something warm." As they walked together to a nearby diner, Mrs. Florida couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the boy. There was something about him that tugged at her heart, something that made her want to protect him, to help him in any way she could. They sat down at a small booth, and Morgan ordered a simple meal. As they waited for their food, Mrs. Florida learned more about his story. He had been living in a foster home for a few years but had run away when things got too difficult. He didn't have any family left, and he had been surviving on the streets for the past few months. "I tried to keep up with my schoolwork," Morgan explained, his voice soft and steady. "But without a place to stay, it's hard. I don't have any money for new books or supplies." Mrs. Florida listened intently, her heart aching for the boy. She knew what it was like to feel lost, to be alone in the world. And as she sat there, she made a decision that would change both of their lives. "You're a smart boy, Morgan," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And you deserve a chance at a better life. I want to help you." Morgan looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Mrs. Florida smiled softly. Because everyone deserves a chance. And I believe in you. As the words left her lips, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know exactly how she would help him, but she was determined to find a way. Little did she know, this decision would set her on a path she could never have imagined. The days that followed their encounter were filled with new beginnings for both Mrs. Florida and Morgan. Mrs. Florida had decided to take the boy under her wing, offering him a temporary place to stay while she figured out how to help him continue his education. Despite the challenges she knew would come, there was a renewed sense of hope in her life. She felt as though she had found a new purpose. Morgan was cautious at first. He had been let down by adults before, and he didn't want to get his hopes up. But there was something about Mrs. Florida that made him trust her. She wasn't like the others. She genuinely seemed to care. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Florida worked tirelessly to gather the resources Morgan needed. She visited schools, spoke to teachers, and explored different scholarship opportunities. But no matter how hard she tried, it seemed like there was always another obstacle in their way. One afternoon, after yet another disappointing meeting with a school administrator, Mrs. Florida sat down at her kitchen table, her head in her hands. She had never felt so defeated. But as she glanced over at Morgan, who was quietly reading in the living room, she knew she couldn't give up. He deserved better. In a moment of desperation, she made a decision that would change everything. She would sell her house, the only thing she had left of value, to pay for Morgan's education. It was a bold move, and one that she knew would leave her with nothing. But in her heart, she believed it was the right thing to do. Mrs. Florida sat in her living room, staring at the neatly stacked papers in front of her, the documents that would finalize the sale of her house. She had made the decision after long nights of contemplating, tossing and turning in her bed. The walls that had once brought her comfort now felt like a cage. They were just bricks, she told herself. What truly mattered was the life she could help build for Morgan. Morgan, sitting at the small desk in the corner, still looked unsure. Though he had grown to trust Mrs. Florida, the magnitude of her decision left him speechless. He had never asked for this, never expected someone to give up so much for him. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Florida?" Morgan finally spoke, his voice tinged with worry. She turned to face him, offering a reassuring smile. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Morgan. You have a bright future ahead of you. This house has served its purpose for me. Now it's time for me to help you." Morgan's face reflected a mix of gratitude and guilt. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you," he murmured. "You don't need to repay me," she replied gently. "Your success will be enough. Knowing that you've made something of yourself is all the reward I need." The house was officially put on the market a few days later, and it didn't take long for interested buyers to swoop in. Mrs. Florida's home was in a prime location, and within a month, she had sold it for a decent sum, enough to cover Morgan's tuition and expenses for years to come. The process had been quick, too quick for her to fully process the fact that soon, she would have no place to call her own. With the money in hand, she immediately enrolled Morgan in a prestigious private school, one that would open doors for him. She bought him new clothes, books, and everything he needed to start his new life. The glow on Morgan's face made every sacrifice worthwhile. For the first time in years, Mrs. Florida felt like she had found her true purpose. But as moving day approached, reality began to settle in. With the house sold, Mrs. Florida had nowhere to go. The shelter down the street had agreed to take her in temporarily, but the thought of leaving behind the life she had known for so long was overwhelming. She packed her belongings into a few suitcases, keeping only the essentials. On the day of the move, Morgan stood in the doorway, watching as Mrs. Florida finished packing the last of her things. "Where will you go now?" he asked softly, concern lacing his words. "I'll be all right," she said with a wave of her hand. "Don't worry about me. You just focus on your studies, all right?" As they stood by the curb, waiting for Morgan's ride to his new school, he turned to her one last time. "I promise I'll make you proud," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I know you will," Mrs. Florida replied, giving him a tight hug. And with that, Morgan left for his new life, while Mrs. Florida turned toward an uncertain future. But in her heart, she believed it was all worth it. The shelter was cold. It wasn't just the air, but the atmosphere. The constant hustle of people coming and going, the uncertainty in their eyes. Mrs. Florida sat on a metal cot in the corner, her few belongings stashed underneath. It had only been a week since she had sold her house and moved into the shelter, but it felt like a lifetime. She had always been independent, always had a place to call her own. Now, she was just another face among many, a person who had fallen through the cracks. At night, the noises around her made it difficult to sleep. The shelter was full of people with their own stories, some murmuring in their sleep, others talking quietly to themselves in the dark. Every now and then a child would cry, a reminder that even in hardship, life went on. Mrs. Florida clutched the thin blanket around her shoulders, trying to find warmth. During the day, she tried to keep herself busy. The shelter staff offered various volunteer opportunities, and she threw herself into helping where she could, serving meals, cleaning, organizing donations. It helped her take her mind off the uncertainty of her own situation. She couldn't help but feel lost, despite the satisfaction of knowing that Morgan was finally getting the education he deserved. Morgan had written to her once since he started school, a short letter expressing his gratitude and excitement about his classes. He was thriving in the new environment, making friends and excelling in his studies. Mrs. Florida read his letter over and over again, using it as a source of strength to get through the difficult days. Knowing that Morgan was happy gave her hope, even if her own future seemed bleak. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of her decision began to sink in. She had given up everything for him, her house, her security, her comfort. The little money she had left from the sale of the house was dwindling, and she knew she couldn't stay at the shelter forever. She needed to find a way to support herself. One afternoon, while sitting on a park bench outside the shelter, she watched people pass by. Mothers with their children, businessmen in suits, young couples holding hands. She wondered if any of them could see her, really see her, or if she had become invisible like so many others who lived on the streets. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she gazed at the world moving around her. She was proud of what she had done for Morgan, but the loneliness was overwhelming. It was a cold realization that the sacrifice she had made for him had left her with nothing to fall back on. As night fell, she returned to the shelter, walking through the crowded common room. A few familiar faces greeted her, but most of them were strangers. The thought of spending another night on the hard cot made her stomach churn, but she had no choice. This was her reality now. But despite it all, Mrs. Florida clung to the belief that she had done the right thing. Morgan was safe, educated, and on a path to success. That was all that mattered, wasn't it? She had given him a chance, a future, something she had never had herself. As she lay down that night, her body aching from the strain of another long day, she whispered a quiet prayer. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for her too. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Life at the shelter became routine for Mrs. Florida. She had adjusted to the hum of life there, to the unpredictability of her surroundings, but deep down, there was a restlessness in her heart. She clung to the hope that Morgan would stay in touch, that his education would be the key to a better life for both of them. She wrote to him often, sending letters to the school, asking about his progress, his new friends, and his studies. At first, he would reply with short but warm notes, always expressing gratitude for her sacrifice. But as time went on, the letters stopped coming. Weeks went by without a word, and Mrs. Florida's heart began to sink. One afternoon, while sorting through donations at the shelter, she felt a familiar pang of worry. She had checked with the school several times, but they assured her that Morgan was still enrolled, excelling in his classes. They couldn't share much more due to privacy policies, and while she understood, it didn't ease her mind. Why hadn't he written? As the days dragged on, the silence from Morgan became unbearable. Mrs. Florida would walk through the park near the shelter every afternoon, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she would see him coming toward her, smiling, ready to share news of his success. But each day ended in disappointment. The bench where they had first met became her place of reflection, a spot where she would sit and remember that first conversation, when Morgan had seemed so lost and alone. Now it was she who felt lost. One evening, after a particularly cold and rainy day, Mrs. Florida returned to the shelter soaked and tired. She sat on her cot, staring at the few personal belongings she had left, a small photo album, some clothes, and a handful of letters from Morgan. She pulled out the letters and reread them for what felt like the 100th time. They were her only connection to him now, and she feared that connection was slipping away. The thought that he might have forgotten her gnawed at her. Had he moved on without her? Had the boy she had sacrificed everything for simply left her behind? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but she had no way of reaching him directly. All she could do was wait. Days continued to pass without any word from Morgan, and her fears grew stronger. The shelter felt colder, the nights longer, and the future darker. Then one day, after nearly 6 months of silence, she received a letter. Her heart raced as she tore it open, hoping for some news from Morgan. But as her eyes scanned the page, she realized it wasn't from him. It was from the school. The letter was brief and formal, informing her that Morgan had abruptly left the institution a few months prior. No one knew where he had gone, and his belongings had been left behind in his dorm. Mrs. Florida's heart sank. Morgan had vanished. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had sold her home, given up everything for this boy, and now he was gone, without a trace, without a word. She felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal, her chest tightening as the weight of her sacrifice came crashing down. How could he leave her like this? After all she had done, after all she had given, how could he just disappear? For the first time in months, Mrs. Florida felt completely and utterly alone. The news of Morgan's sudden disappearance left Mrs. Florida numb. The days following the letter blurred together, each one filled with the same crushing weight of betrayal. She had given everything to help him. A roof over his head, the chance at an education, and most of all, the love she had never had the chance to give her own child. And now it felt like all of it had been for nothing. Each morning she rose from her cot in the shelter, her body moving through the motions, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in an endless loop of why. Why had Morgan left without saying goodbye? Why hadn't he come back? She had believed in him, believed in his potential, and most importantly, believed in his gratitude. She had never expected to be repaid, but she had expected him to remember her, to value the sacrifice she had made. As she walked through the park one particularly chilly morning, Mrs. Florida found herself drawn back to the bench where she had first met Morgan. The memories of that day felt so distant now. She had seen something in him that day. A spark, a potential that had reminded her of the children she would never have. It had given her a sense of purpose, a reason to believe that her life had meaning beyond herself. Now, sitting on the same bench, that purpose felt hollow. A few of the shelter volunteers had noticed her withdrawn state, offering kind words and small gestures of comfort. But Mrs. Florida had grown tired of reassurances. Words couldn't change the fact that she was now homeless, that her once promising connection with Morgan had disintegrated into thin air. Each time she closed her eyes, she replayed his disappearance, imagining different reasons why he might have left. Had something happened to him? Was he in trouble? Or was it worse, had he simply moved on and forgotten her? Her thoughts spiraled further each day, and soon enough, even the simple tasks she used to enjoy, helping out at the shelter, chatting with others, became unbearable reminders of her sacrifice. The very shelter where she had taken refuge after selling her home now felt like a prison. Every time she passed by someone who had once asked for her advice, she felt the sting of her own failure. One evening, as the cold winter winds whipped through the shelter's drafty hallways, Mrs. Florida lay on her cot, staring up at the ceiling. She had thought that helping Morgan would bring her fulfillment, would fill the void left by years of childlessness and loneliness. But now, she wasn't sure if she had made the right decision. Maybe she had been naive, blinded by her own need for purpose. But what hurt the most wasn't the thought that she had been wrong about Morgan. What hurt the most was the idea that she had been forgotten. It felt like she had given him everything, her home, her time, her heart, and in return she had been left with nothing. That emptiness, that sense of being discarded, gnawed at her soul like a festering wound. She could hear the sounds of the city outside the shelter, cars passing by, distant voices, the hum of life going on as if nothing had happened. But for Mrs. Florida, everything had changed. The life she had known, the life she had built, had crumbled to dust. As the hours ticked by, she realized that waiting for answers wasn't enough. She couldn't sit by and hope that Morgan would return. She needed to know what had happened, even if the truth was painful. She needed to find him, no matter the cost. With a new resolve brewing inside her, Mrs. Florida sat up in bed. She didn't know where to start, but she knew she couldn't let this betrayal define the rest of her life. Tomorrow, she would begin the search for Morgan. And she wouldn't stop until she had the answers she needed. The next morning, Mrs. Florida woke with a determination she hadn't felt in months. The weight of Morgan's disappearance still sat heavy on her chest, but now there was a spark of energy driving her forward. She had to know what had happened, and sitting idly in the shelter wasn't going to provide answers. For too long, she had allowed the uncertainty to paralyze her, but not anymore. She started by visiting the school where Morgan had been enrolled. Walking through the well-kept campus, she couldn't help but feel a pang of envy for the students who strolled across the grounds without a care in the world. She had sacrificed everything for Morgan to be part of this life, and yet it had all slipped through her fingers. When she reached the school's administration office, she was greeted by a polite receptionist who, after hearing Mrs. Florida's request, led her to the office of the school's principal. The principal, a tall, stern woman in her 50s, greeted her with a nod and gestured for her to sit. "Mrs. Florida, we've received your previous inquiries about Morgan's departure," the principal began, her voice calm but firm. "As I mentioned in our letter, Morgan left school quite suddenly. We don't know where he went, but he didn't leave any forwarding information." Mrs. Florida took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. "I just need to know if there's anything else. Did he say anything to anyone? Leave behind any personal belongings?" The principal frowned slightly and opened a folder on her desk. Morgan was a bright student, but he kept mostly to himself. From what we gathered, he didn't form many close friendships. However, one of his teachers mentioned that in his final days here, Morgan had become increasingly withdrawn. "Withdrawn?" Mrs. Florida echoed, a sinking feeling in her chest. "Did anyone ask him why?" "We tried," the principal said with a sigh, "but he wasn't forthcoming. He handed in his final assignments, collected his belongings, and left. It was as though he'd made up his mind to disappear." Mrs. Florida's mind raced. Why hadn't Morgan reached out to her? She had given him everything, and now it seemed like he had cut ties with the very people who were helping him succeed. "Can I see his dorm room?" she asked, hoping there might be some clue left behind. "I'm afraid the room has been reassigned," the principal replied, her tone sympathetic. "But I can show you the few items he left behind. We stored them in the lost and found." A flicker of hope sparked in Mrs. Florida's heart. It wasn't much, but it was something. The principal led her down the hallway to a small, cramped room filled with forgotten backpacks, jackets, and other miscellaneous items. There, in the corner, was a box with Morgan's name scrawled on the side. Mrs. Florida knelt beside the box and opened it carefully. Inside, she found a few notebooks, some worn clothes, and a battered old photo of Morgan as a young boy. Her heart clenched as she realized that this was all he had left behind. No letters, no explanation, just fragments of the life she had tried to build for him. But at the bottom of the box, beneath a pile of papers, Mrs. Florida found something that made her pause. It was a crumpled map, one that looked like it had been folded and refolded countless times. On the map, there were several markings, as if Morgan had been charting a journey. There were circles drawn around different parts of the city, but no names or clues to what they meant. "What is this?" Mrs. Florida whispered to herself, running her fingers over the worn paper. The principal leaned over her shoulder. "I'm not sure," she said. "It looks like he was planning something." Mrs. Florida's mind raced as she studied the map. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. If Morgan had been mapping out locations in the city, then maybe she could use it to find him. "I'll take this," Mrs. Florida said, folding the map carefully and slipping it into her bag. As she left the school, the map pressed tightly against her side. Mrs. Florida felt a renewed sense of purpose. Morgan had left something behind after all, a clue. And now, it was up to her to follow the trail he had laid, to uncover the truth about why he had vanished and where he had gone. The search had begun, and she wouldn't stop until she found him. With the crumpled map in her hand, Mrs. Florida felt a glimmer of hope. It was the first real lead she had on Morgan's whereabouts since he disappeared. The circles marked on the map intrigued her, each one placed in seemingly random locations across the city. They didn't appear to follow a particular route, but something told her they were important. She spent the night in the shelter, unable to sleep as she stared at the map by the dim light of a nearby lamp. What had Morgan been doing? Why had he drawn these circles? As the first light of dawn broke through the cracks of the old shelter windows, Mrs. Florida made up her mind. She would visit each of these places and find out for herself. The next morning, she set off with the map folded neatly in her pocket. Her first stop was a quiet park on the edge of the city, one of the locations Morgan had circled. As she arrived, she scanned the area, taking in the peaceful surroundings. The park was nearly empty, save for a few joggers and an elderly couple walking their dog. It didn't seem like the kind of place where someone would hide or disappear, but Mrs. Florida walked through it anyway, hoping to find some sort of clue. She wandered along the path, her eyes searching for anything out of the ordinary. After nearly an hour, she found herself sitting on a bench under a large oak tree, the frustration beginning to mount. There was nothing here. No sign of Morgan, no indication that this place had any significance. But just as she was about to give up and move on to the next location, a memory flashed through her mind. It was the first day she met Morgan. They had sat on a bench, much like this one, and talked about his future. He had been so quiet, so uncertain of himself, and yet there had been a spark in his eyes when they talked about education and possibility. Mrs. Florida stood up from the bench, her mind racing. Could it be that this park held some emotional value to Morgan? Maybe this was a place where he had come to think, to reflect. She walked toward a small playground at the edge of the park, and there she spotted something. Another bench, much older and worn than the one she had been sitting on. Carved into the wood of the bench were initials. M+F. Her breath caught in her throat. Morgan had been here. The initials were his, and the F was her own. A wave of emotion washed over her. He hadn't forgotten her. For all his silence, he had left a small mark, a symbol that their connection had meant something to him. Encouraged by this tiny discovery, Mrs. Florida took a deep breath and pressed on. The next circle on the map led her to an old library downtown. It was a massive building with towering shelves filled with books. Exactly the kind of place she could imagine Morgan spending his time. Inside, the musty smell of old pages greeted her as she walked through the aisles, her eyes scanning the rows of books. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she trusted her instincts. She searched the quiet corners of the library, hoping to find another clue, another sign that Morgan had been here. Hours passed with no success, and Mrs. Florida began to feel her energy waning. But just as she was about to leave, she spotted something in the far corner of the reading room, a scrap of paper sticking out from under a chair. She bent down to pick it up, her heart pounding. It was a page torn from a notebook, with a single word scrawled across it. Soon. Mrs. Florida stared at the word, her mind racing. Soon. What did that mean? Was it a message from Morgan? Was he planning to return? Her thoughts tumbled over one another, but one thing was clear, she was getting closer. With renewed determination, Mrs. Florida folded the paper and placed it with the map. She wasn't sure how the pieces fit together just yet, but she knew she had to keep going. Morgan had left a trail, and she was determined to follow it, no matter how long it took. The search was far from over, but for the first time in months, Mrs. Florida felt a flicker of hope. Morgan was out there somewhere, and she was getting closer to finding him. The next morning, Mrs. Florida woke with a renewed sense of urgency. The scrap of paper she found in the library, with the word soon scrawled across it, played on her mind. It was a message, she was sure of it, but what it meant or how close she was to finding Morgan remained unclear. She unfolded the map once more, her eyes drawn to the next circle, an old bus station on the outskirts of town. The bus station was a far cry from the bustling hub it had once been. Now, it was mostly used by locals looking for cheap transportation to nearby towns, a place where the desperate or weary came and went without much attention. Mrs. Florida had never been to this part of the city before, and as she walked toward the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that Morgan had chosen this location deliberately. The faded, peeling paint on the station walls and the rusted benches gave the place a sense of abandonment, much like how Mrs. Florida felt in the months after Morgan's disappearance. But she wasn't here to dwell on her emotions. She was here to find answers. As she approached the ticket counter, the old man behind the glass looked up from his newspaper with a bored expression. "Help you?" he asked, his voice raspy from years of disuse. "I'm looking for someone," Mrs. Florida said, clutching the map in her hand. "A boy about 16, black. He may have passed through here a few months ago. His name is Morgan." The man shrugged, barely looking up from his paper. "Lots of people come through here, lady. I don't keep track." Mrs. Florida sighed, feeling a familiar wave of frustration. But just as she turned to leave, a voice from behind her interrupted. "Wait." She spun around to see a young man sitting on one of the benches. His eyes focused on her with an intensity that caught her off guard. He looked to be in his early 20s, with a rugged appearance that suggested he had been on the road for some time. "You said Morgan?" the man asked, standing up and walking toward her. "I know him." Mrs. Florida's heart skipped a beat. "You do? Do you know where he is?" The man nodded slowly, his expression cautious. "Yeah, I met him a few months ago. We were both staying at a shelter near here." He didn't say much, kept to himself, but we shared a few conversations. He paused, studying Mrs. Florida's anxious face. "He mentioned someone, an older woman who helped him. I guess that's you." Mrs. Florida felt a surge of hope. "Yes, that's me. I'm Mrs. Florida. I haven't heard from him in months. I've been searching everywhere for him. Do you know where he went?" The young man looked down, a shadow crossing his face. Morgan was a good kid, but he seemed troubled, like he was carrying something heavy. One day he just vanished. Didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a trace. I figured he was running from something. Mrs. Florida's chest tightened. "Did he say anything about why he left? Or where he might go?" The man hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. "Before he left, he gave this to me. Told me to hold on to it, said it was important. I didn't understand why, but maybe it's for you." He handed the paper to Mrs. Florida, and her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The message was simple, just a few words, but it made her heart race. "Trust the journey. You'll find me where it all began." Mrs. Florida stared at the note, her mind racing. Where it all began. What did that mean? She thought back to the moment she first met Morgan, the bench in the park, the quiet conversation they'd shared. Could that be it? "Do you know what this means?" she asked the young man, her voice thick with emotion. He shook his head. "No, but whatever it is, he seemed sure that you'd understand." Mrs. Florida stood there for a moment, the weight of the note heavy in her hand. Where it all began. The park, she realized. It had to be the park where they first met. That was the only place that made sense. With a nod of thanks to the young man, she turned and hurried out of the bus station, her heart pounding in her chest. She was close now, closer than she had ever been. The park was only a short distance away, and as she made her way back to the place where their story began, Mrs. Florida couldn't help but feel that this journey, no matter how painful, was leading her to something important. She just hoped that when she arrived, Morgan would be there, waiting. Mrs. Florida hurried through the familiar streets, her heart pounding with anticipation. The cryptic message, "You'll find me where it all began," repeated in her mind like a drumbeat. She was certain now. It had to be the park where she had first met Morgan, where their connection had started. Every step brought a surge of memories. The sight of Morgan sitting on the bench, the way he had clutched his book, the quiet desperation in his eyes. By the time she reached the park, the sun was already sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The familiar old oak tree stood tall at the edge of the playground, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. She walked slowly, scanning the area, her eyes searching for any sign of Morgan. But the park was almost empty. A few children were playing in the distance, and an elderly couple sat on a nearby bench, feeding birds. The bench where she had first spoken to Morgan stood unoccupied, as though waiting for her. Mrs. Florida's heart sank. She had been so sure this was the place. Was she wrong? Had she misunderstood the message? She sat down on the bench, the same one where they had met all those months ago, and closed her eyes. The weight of her journey settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had come so far, sacrificed so much, and still, she felt no closer to finding Morgan. The cool evening air brushed against her face, and for a moment, she allowed herself to remember the joy she had felt that day in the park, the hope she had nurtured for Morgan's future. She had believed in him, trusted that he would make something of himself. But now, all she had were fragments. A torn map, a single word on a scrap of paper, and a cryptic message leading her back to where it all started. She sighed deeply, her hands resting on her lap. Maybe this was the end of the road. Maybe Morgan had meant for her to return here, not to find him, but to reflect on the journey they had shared. Just as the thought crossed her mind, she heard a soft voice behind her. Mrs. Florida. Her heart leapt into her throat. She turned quickly, her breath catching in her chest, and there, standing just a few feet away, was Morgan. He looked older, taller, his face leaner than she remembered. His clothes were simple, but his eyes, the same dark, thoughtful eyes, held a depth she hadn't seen before. For a moment, she could hardly speak, her emotions tangled in a mix of relief, confusion, and disbelief. "Morgan," she whispered, standing up slowly. He took a tentative step closer, his expression both cautious and remorseful. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice full of regret. "I never meant to leave you without a word. I didn't know how to explain everything." Tears welled up in Mrs. Florida's eyes, but she held them back, not wanting to lose this moment. "You just disappeared, Morgan," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been searching for you for months. I didn't know if something had happened to you, or if you'd just—" "I didn't forget you," he interrupted gently. "I never could. You gave me everything, and I never wanted you to think I was ungrateful. I needed time to figure things out." Mrs. Florida took a step toward him, her hand reaching out as if to make sure he was real. "Where did you go, Morgan? Why didn't you tell me?" Morgan looked down, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I needed to find out who I was, what I wanted for myself. You did so much for me, and I felt like I owed you more than just good grades and a diploma. I didn't want to come back to you until I had something to offer in return." Mrs. Florida's heart softened, understanding flooding her as she watched the boy she had cared for struggle with the weight of her sacrifice. "You didn't owe me anything, Morgan," she said softly. "I helped you because I believed in you, because I loved you like my own. That was enough for me." Morgan's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the tension between them dissolved. "I know that now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm ready to make things right." He pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, but this one was crisp and new. "This is for you," he said, handing it to her. Mrs. Florida hesitated for a moment before taking it, unfolding the paper with trembling hands. It was a deed, her name written at the top, and beneath it, the address of a home. "I bought you a house," Morgan said, his voice steady but emotional. "It's not just a house, though. It's everything you gave me back and more. I wanted to make sure you'd never have to worry again." Mrs. Florida's tears finally spilled over, her hands shaking as she held the paper. She looked up at Morgan, her heart swelling with pride, gratitude, and overwhelming love. "You didn't have to do this. Morgan stepped closer, his expression sincere. Had to. For you and for everything you gave me. I'm a better person because of you. And in that moment, Mrs. Florida knew that the journey had been worth every step. Tears continued to flow down Mrs. Florida's cheeks as she stared at the deed in her hands. She couldn't believe what she was reading. Her name written at the top, attached to a house she had never seen, yet felt like the most precious gift she had ever received. The weight of her long search, the months of worry, and the fear that Morgan had forgotten her all melted away in the face of his overwhelming gesture. Morgan stood quietly, watching her reaction. His eyes were filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension, as though he wasn't sure how she would respond. He had changed so much from the boy she had met on that park bench all those months ago. There was a quiet strength about him now, a maturity that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Florida blinked back her tears and looked up at him. Her voice shaky but filled with emotion. Morgan, I don't even know what to say. This is more than I ever expected, more than I ever wanted. Morgan smiled gently, stepping closer. It's the least I could do. You gave me everything when I had nothing, and I'll never forget that. I wanted to make sure you're taken care of, just like you took care of me. Mrs. Florida shook her head, overwhelmed by his kindness. But how? How did you do all this? You were just a boy when you left. How did you manage to buy a house? Morgan chuckled softly, the tension in his face easing as he sat down on the bench beside her. It's a long story, he began, glancing down at the ground. After I left school, I realized that the education you gave me was only the beginning. I was still trying to figure out who I was, what I wanted. I traveled for a bit, worked odd jobs, but the real turning point came when I met someone who saw my potential. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I ended up working for a tech startup in the city, a small company with big ideas. They needed someone with fresh eyes and a drive to learn, and I was eager to prove myself. I worked hard, learned everything I could, and eventually I became part of the core team. The company grew quickly, and I was there for it all. Before I knew it, I had shares in the company. And when we got bought out, I suddenly had more money than I ever dreamed of. Mrs. Florida listened in stunned silence. She had never imagined that the quiet, withdrawn boy she had helped would go on to build such a life for himself. You never told me, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. You could have reached out, Morgan. I would have been so proud. Morgan's face softened. No. And I should have. But part of me wanted to come back to you with something real. Something to show that your sacrifice meant something. I didn't want to return empty-handed. I wanted to give back to you what you had given to me. A chance at a new life. Mrs. Florida placed her hand on his, squeezing gently. You were never empty-handed, Morgan. You were always enough just as you were. I didn't help you because I wanted something in return. I did it because I loved you, because I believed in you. Morgan's eyes glistened with emotion. And that's why I'm here now. I know I disappeared, and I can't undo the time I've been gone. But I'm back now, and I want to make things right. Mrs. Florida smiled through her tears, her heart full of love and gratitude. You already have. Just knowing you're safe and happy is more than I could ever ask for. But this, she held up the deed again, shaking her head in disbelief. This is beyond anything I could have imagined. Morgan grinned, a boyish light returning to his eyes. I want you to come see it. The house. It's yours, and it's waiting for you. Mrs. Florida's heart swelled with anticipation. New house. A new beginning. It felt like a dream, one she hadn't dared to believe could come true after everything she had lost. She nodded, feeling the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. Let's go see it, she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. Morgan stood, offering his hand to help her up from the bench. As they walked together out of the park, the place where their story had begun, Mrs. Florida realized that their journey wasn't ending here. It was only just beginning. Together this time, with a future brighter than she had ever dreamed possible. As Mrs. Florida and Morgan made their way to the house, the excitement built inside her. She still couldn't believe that Morgan had gone to such lengths, not just to repay her, but to give her a new beginning. The drive was quiet, with both of them lost in their own thoughts, But there was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond that had been reforged through love, sacrifice, and time. When they finally pulled up to the house, Mrs. Florida's breath caught in her throat. It was beautiful. Nestled on a quiet street, the house stood proudly with its charming front porch, large windows, and neatly trimmed garden. It wasn't overly grand, but it was perfect, warm, inviting, and full of potential. It was everything she had lost and more. Morgan turned to her with a wide smile. "I know it's not a mansion, but I wanted something that felt like home." Tears welled up in Mrs. Florida's eyes once again. She couldn't speak for a moment as she took in the sight before her. The house represented so much more than just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of everything she had hoped for, everything she had fought for, both for herself and for Morgan. It's perfect," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Morgan led her up the steps and unlocked the door. As they stepped inside, Mrs. Florida felt warmth wash over her. The interior was just as beautiful as the outside. Simple yet elegant. Light flooded the open living room through large windows, and the furnishings were minimal but tasteful. "I thought you'd want to decorate it yourself," Morgan said, walking beside her. "Make it truly yours." Mrs. Florida wandered from room to room, her heart swelling with every step. Each room held the promise of new memories, new beginnings. She could already see herself cooking in the kitchen, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, and most importantly, living a life without the fear of being lost or forgotten. When she turned back to Morgan, her heart was full. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. You've given me more than I ever dreamed." Morgan smiled, his eyes shining. "No, Mrs. Florida, you gave me everything first. This is just the beginning for both of us." In the days that followed, Mrs. Florida slowly settled into her new home. It was surreal at first, waking up each morning in a house that was hers, warm, secure, and filled with the promise of peace. She spent her time exploring every corner, decorating little by little, adding personal touches that made the space feel truly hers. The scent of fresh flowers filled the rooms, and soft curtains fluttered gently in the breeze from the open windows. Morgan visited often, helping her with the heavier tasks and ensuring she had everything she needed. He even brought her small gifts, books for the cozy reading nook she had set up, and beautiful kitchenware for the meals she would soon cook. Their bond grew even stronger, no longer defined by sacrifice or guilt but by the love and care they shared. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch together, sipping tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mrs. Florida glanced over at Morgan. "I still can't believe all of this, you know," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've given me a life I never thought I'd have." Morgan smiled softly, setting his cup down. "You've earned it, Mrs. Florida. Everything I've done is because of what you gave me. I want you to have the life you deserve." For the first time in years, Mrs. Florida felt at peace. No longer haunted by uncertainty, she embraced this new chapter of her life, knowing that it was built on love, hope, and the beautiful connection she and Morgan had forged together. As the evening sky darkened, she knew that this was the beginning of the happiest years of her life. As time passed, Mrs. Florida's life began to flourish in ways she had never imagined. The house became more than just a place of refuge. It became a symbol of her resilience, her generosity, and her connection with Morgan. With each passing day, she found new joys in the simplest things, tending to her garden, baking treats for the neighbors, and hosting small gatherings of friends she had met along the way. But there was a lingering thought in her heart, a desire to give back, to do for others what she had done for Morgan. She had experienced firsthand the power of kindness and the importance of having someone believe in you. Now she wanted to extend that same opportunity to others. One afternoon, while sitting with Morgan in the living room, she shared her thoughts. "I've been thinking," she began, looking at him thoughtfully. "What if I started a foundation? Something to help young people like you, those who need a chance, who don't have anyone to support them." Morgan's face lit up with enthusiasm. "That's an amazing idea, Mrs. Florida. You've already changed my life. Imagine how many more people you could help." Encouraged by his support, Mrs. Florida felt a new sense of purpose fill her. She knew that her journey with Morgan had been just the beginning, and now she was ready to create something even bigger, something that could leave a lasting legacy. Together they began planning. Morgan, with his connections and newfound success, was eager to help, and soon the vision of the foundation started to take shape. Mrs. Florida's heart swelled with excitement, knowing that she could continue to make a difference, one life at a time. With Morgan's guidance and Mrs. Florida's unwavering determination, the foundation they envisioned began to take form. They named it the Florida Morgan Foundation, a tribute to the bond they shared and the journey they had traveled together. The foundation's mission was simple yet profound: to support underprivileged young people who had the potential but lacked the resources to pursue their dreams. They started small, using Morgan's contacts in the business world to gather donors and resources. Mrs. Florida, with her nurturing spirit, began reaching out to shelters and schools, seeking out children who needed a helping hand. She met with social workers and community leaders, determined to give others the same chance she had given Morgan. One day, while visiting a local shelter, Mrs. Florida met a young girl named Amara. At 15, Amara reminded her so much of Morgan: quiet, intelligent, and full of potential but weighed down by her circumstances. She had been living in the shelter with her younger siblings, struggling to stay in school while caring for them. Mrs. Florida sat down with Amara, listening to her story, and felt the familiar tug on her heart. This was why she had started the foundation. She offered Amara a scholarship to continue her education, as well as financial support for her family. The gratitude in Amara's eyes reminded Mrs. Florida of the impact she had made on Morgan's life. As the foundation grew, so did its reach, helping dozens of children like Amara. Each success story filled Mrs. Florida with joy, knowing that she was building something far greater than she had ever imagined: a legacy of love, generosity, and second chances. And it all started with one boy on a park bench. As word of the Florida Morgan Foundation spread, more and more people became involved in its mission. Local businesses offered their support, and community members began volunteering their time and resources to help. Mrs. Florida found herself at the center of a growing movement, one that was changing lives in ways she had never thought possible. Morgan, now fully immersed in his role as a successful entrepreneur, continued to be her biggest supporter. He helped secure funding from major donors and organized charity events that brought attention to their cause. Together they were unstoppable, driven by the same passion that had brought them together in the first place. One afternoon, as they sat in the foundation's modest office space, a small but vibrant hub of activity, Morgan turned to Mrs. Florida with a thoughtful expression. "You've done something incredible here," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "But have you ever thought about taking this further? Expanding beyond just this city?" Mrs. Florida raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the idea. "What do you mean?" Morgan smiled. "We could take the foundation national, maybe even international. There are kids all over the world who could benefit from what we're doing. Imagine the impact we could have if we broadened our reach." The thought excited Mrs. Florida. She had always envisioned helping others, but the idea of expanding on such a large scale was something she had never considered. It was ambitious, but with Morgan by her side, anything felt possible. "I love that idea," she said, her eyes bright with determination. "Let's do it." And with that, the next chapter of the foundation's journey began. What had started as a small act of kindness was now blossoming into a global force for change. One child at a time. As the foundation grew, so did the challenges. Expanding beyond their city meant navigating unfamiliar terrain, both figuratively and literally. The process of going national, and eventually international, brought unexpected hurdles. There were bureaucratic obstacles, legal requirements, and cultural differences that needed to be addressed. Mrs. Florida found herself feeling overwhelmed at times. While she had always been driven by her desire to help, the complexities of running such a large operation often left her exhausted. Meetings with lawyers, accountants, and international representatives filled her days. Despite Morgan's unwavering support, there were moments when she doubted whether they could pull off such an ambitious project. But each time the doubt crept in, Mrs. Florida reminded herself why she had started the foundation in the first place. She thought of Morgan, of Amara, and of all the children they had helped. Their lives were living proof that this work mattered. Morgan, noticing the strain on her, took on more of the administrative burden, ensuring that Mrs. Florida could focus on the heart of the foundation, meeting with the children, listening to their stories, and finding ways to provide them with the support they needed. "Don't worry, Mrs. Florida," Morgan reassured her one evening after a long day. "We'll figure this out. We always do." His words gave her comfort. She realized that, despite the challenges, they had already accomplished so much. And with the right team in place, they could continue to grow the foundation without losing sight of its mission. Determined to persevere, Mrs. Florida approached the next phase of expansion with renewed energy, ready to face the obstacles ahead and turn them into opportunities for even greater impact. With the expansion plan set in motion, the Florida Morgan Foundation quickly spread its wings across the country. New branches were opened in cities where young people struggled the most, and soon, they were receiving applications from children in every corner of the nation. The work was demanding, but it was also deeply rewarding. Mrs. Florida often traveled to meet with local representatives, sharing her vision and encouraging communities to get involved. Every time she met a child whose life had been touched by the foundation, it reminded her why she had embarked on this journey in the first place. Each smile, each success story, was a testament to the power of giving and believing in others. Morgan was thriving as well. His leadership skills had grown, and he had become a trusted figure in the nonprofit world. He took charge of major fundraising events, often appearing on national platforms to talk about the foundation's mission. His success as a businessman was now intertwined with his passion for philanthropy, and he couldn't have been prouder of what he and Mrs. Florida had built together. During one of their largest fundraising galas, Mrs. Florida stood on stage, looking out at the room filled with supporters, donors, and children whose lives had been transformed. Her heart swelled with pride and gratitude. "This foundation started with a single act of kindness," she said, addressing the crowd. "And now, because of your support, we're able to help so many more young people achieve their dreams. Together, we're building a future where every child, no matter their background, has a chance to succeed." The applause that followed was thunderous. Mrs. Florida looked over at Morgan, who nodded at her with a smile. They were making a difference, and their work was far from over. With the foundation firmly established across the country, Morgan and Mrs. Florida set their sights on the next step: going global. They were determined to take their mission beyond borders, helping children in underdeveloped regions gain access to education and opportunities. Morgan, ever the strategist, worked tirelessly to build partnerships with international organizations. He arranged meetings with global leaders, traveled to different countries, and sought out communities where their work could make the most difference. Mrs. Florida, on the other hand, focused on building relationships with local communities, learning about their unique challenges and how the foundation could adapt to meet their needs. One of their first international projects was in Africa, in a small village where children had little access to education. The foundation funded the construction of a school, provided resources for teachers, and set up scholarships for the most promising students. Mrs. Florida traveled to the village for the opening ceremony, and when she saw the children's faces light up with excitement, she knew that their global vision was coming to life. As she walked through the newly built classrooms, Mrs. Florida reflected on how far she and Morgan had come. From a small bench in a park to a worldwide movement, their journey had been filled with twists and turns, but their shared mission had never wavered. "We're just getting started," Morgan said, standing beside her as they looked out at the children playing in the schoolyard. "There are still so many more lives to touch." Mrs. Florida smiled, her heart full. "Yes, we are. And we'll keep going, one child at a time." Years passed, and the Florida Morgan Foundation became a beacon of hope for children around the world. What had started as a personal mission for Mrs. Florida had grown into a global force for good, transforming the lives of countless young people. The foundation's work expanded into new regions, providing education, healthcare, and opportunities to those who needed it most. As Mrs. Florida grew older, she began to reflect more on the legacy she would leave behind. The foundation had become so much more than she had ever dreamed, and it was clear that its impact would continue long after she was gone. But what mattered most to her wasn't the scale of their success. It was the individual lives they had touched, the children who had found hope and opportunity through the foundation. Morgan had become a leader in the philanthropic world. His success in business now matched by his reputation as a changemaker. He and Mrs. Florida remained close, their bond stronger than ever. They often sat together, reminiscing about how it all began and marveling at how far they had come. One evening, as they sat on the porch of Mrs. Florida's home, Morgan turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You know, none of this would have happened without you. You changed my life, and because of that, we've been able to change so many others." Mrs. Florida smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "It was never just me, Morgan. It was both of us, together. And that's the legacy we've built." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the horizon, Mrs. Florida felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that the foundation would continue to thrive, that her legacy of love, generosity, and hope would live on through the children they had helped, and through Morgan, the boy she had once met on a park bench, who had grown into a man with the power to change the world. And in that moment, Mrs. Florida realized that the greatest gift of all was not what she had given to Morgan, but what they had created together, a future filled with possibility for every child they had touched.